hand it over now to Session Chair Julia Voss of Santa Clara University to introduce the panel and our speakers today. Thank you for joining us.
And I am going to pass the buck right away to my colleague, Chris Bachen, who is going to introduce us and get us started.
Welcome.
Wait, before you get started, to building on what Michael said about chat questions and questions in the chat room, or questions using the chat. I'm also going to be the technical facilitator of our session. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them as they come up in the course of the presentation, and then we'll come back to answer those questions. And of course, others that get asked live after we're done with our initial comments. Okay, now back to you, Chris. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming. On behalf of my colleagues in the Success in Writing, Information, and Research Literacy project that we call SWIRL, I'd like to welcome you to our session today, where we'll share an overview of the work we've been doing at Santa Clara University for the past 5 years. 4 of our team members are here to present today. I'm Chris Bachen, a faculty member in communication and the Director of Assessment at Santa Clara University. We also have Nicole Branch, Santa Clara's Associate University Librarian for Learning and Engagement, and she's also the co-interim University Librarian. We have Laura Doyle, who's a faculty member in Civil, Environmental, and Sustainable Engineering, and serves as a faculty associate for the Collaborative for Teaching Innovation, specializing in assessment. And we have Julia Voss, who's a faculty member in English and department chair, and director of the professional writing program. Also on our team, but not presenting today, are Diana Morlang from the political science department. She's also a university advisor, and Denise Crane from the English department, who also serves as the director for the University Writing Center. So with that, let's move on to our agenda for today. First, we'll share some brief background on our SWIRL initiative, and we'll provide an overview of an assignment design tool that we developed called the Write Tool, which guides the work that we do with faculty in assignment and instructional design to improve student research-informed writing. We'll share some results and conclusions from our evaluation of several years' worth of faculty assignments generated before and after the SWIRL faculty development programs. And then we're eager to open up a conversation with all of you about what you're doing on your campuses to promote student success in research-based writing across the disciplines. So let's go to a little bit of history. Like many initiatives, ours got its start because we recognized we could be doing better, or put another way, that we had some problems. University assessments of student papers and other work products revealed several areas for improvement in students' critical thinking, their use of information, and in their disciplinary writing. And faculty also let us know that they weren't satisfied with students' work, but that they weren't sure how to help students improve. As we were exploring the problem at Santa Clara University, we learned of a 4-day Teaching and Learning National Institute held at Evergreen State College in 2016 for campus teams committed to developing and carrying out evidence-based change initiatives. This experience gave our group the chance to develop a campus-wide initiative. And as a team, we were staff and faculty working across key administrative and disciplinary units. And we knew that that would help ensure that we would have relevance and sustainability of our efforts. We determined that our focus would be on working with faculty on instructional and assignment design as the way to have an influence on the quality of students' skills in information, research literacy, and in writing. At the Institute, we developed the goals and an action plan for the SWIRL initiative. Our experience in sessions with faculty from other campuses and mentors in higher ed were instrumental in helping develop our guiding principles that you see here that emphasize equity, in student learning, evidence-based practices, and iterative curricular and pedagogical development. So turning to our presentation today, we will draw upon the work again of the past 5 years to show how we've developed research-informed instructional materials and tools, and how we work with faculty in faculty learning communities so that faculty can engage in scaffolded critical practice and iterate their own assignments and instructional approaches. And finally, we'll share how we've conducted ongoing assessment that helps us understand how and if and how our work with faculty has been effective, how we might improve, and how to pave the way eventually for an assessment of student learning. And now I'll turn things over to Nicole to share more about our assignment design tool that guided our work with faculty.
Great, thanks, Chris. So the central framework guiding our work with faculty is our writing and research instrument for transfer and equity in higher education, or the WRITE tool. And this was a tool that we developed in 2018 based on assessment of assignments and feedback from faculty, as well as some of the original focus groups and ground assessment that we did in starting this initiative. And with this tool, we sought to expand on the TILT, or Transparency in Teaching and Learning framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we hoped to explicitly address writing, research, and information literacy with the WRITE tool. So as you may know, TILT provides a rationale and evidence for faculty to engage in transparent teaching practices, and it has demonstrated impact on equitable learning for diverse students. So in our work with faculty, we found that while faculty easily adopted the TILT elements, such as clear articulation of assignment purpose, tasks, and criteria for success, we didn't see them having as easy of a time in articulating core elements related to writing and information literacy. So what we hope to do with this tool was to really clearly define some core elements of writing and information literacy in a framework that sort of extended the TILT model. So the WRITE tool includes 5 components, including transparent assignment design, rhetorical and disciplinary context, information and source use, scaffolding, and evaluation. Next slide. And this, I know this is not readable, but there is a copy linked in the chat as well as on our website, but just wanted to give you sort of an overview of what the tool looks like. So the WRITE tool includes several different elements. First, we defined each of the elements of the WRITE tool. Then we provided a rationale as well as criteria for each component. And we chose these elements and criteria because they represent high impact ways to make explicit and transparent the writing and research skills students should develop through these types of research intensive assignments. So it's kind of a quick way for faculty to check their assignments for these core elements. In addition to this WRITE tool, we also have a much longer articulation of the principles behind the elements of the WRITE tool, which is available on our website. So just to go a bit more into the 5 core components, which are also the components that we use to conduct our analysis of assignments. So for transparent assignment design, we looked at purpose for the student. So what will they learn or skills that they will develop by completing the assignment. Tasks, so an explicit explication of the steps to complete the assignment. And then criteria for success, a clear articulation of how the assignment will be assessed. For rhetorical and disciplinary context, criteria include genre and features of the work students will complete, the audience students should address through their work, and the purpose of the product for the audience. For information and source use, core elements include sources expected, but also why those sources are appropriate for that genre or discipline, how to evaluate and use sources, and expectations for citation and documentation of sources, both providing guidance for that as well as contextualizing citation practices within the genre or discipline. In terms of scaffolding, we were looking for articulation of steps and stages for both writing and research, and evaluation included a specific focus on the alignment between evaluation criteria and assignment and description, as well as the desired learning outcomes. So that's an overview of the assignment design tool. In terms of success for Swirl, what we were really hoping to learn through both this initiative as well as our analysis is the research informed improvements of faculty assignments related to the 5 core areas. So how well did faculty assignments improve in those areas? And then for our own team, we wanted to gain a better understanding of the factors that affect faculty learning and implementation to improve student outcomes related to writing, research, and information literacy. And in this, we are interested in overall outcomes as well as differences by discipline or the design of the intervention or the faculty learning community. So that's a little background on the Write tool and Swirl. I'll hand it over to Laura now, who will share some of our current findings.
Thank you, Nicole. So before I move into the results of what we saw by looking at assignments coming out of Swirl, I just want to talk a little bit about how we provided these offerings. So we, as it was alluded to earlier, provided or ran FLCs, and we ran 4 different versions of FLCs over the course of 2 or 3 academic years. The first one, our first cohort was 12 sessions over the entire academic year. The other sessions were shorter and contained to just 1 quarter. We're on a quarter system. So sessions 2 and 3 were 4 sessions, and then the last session was just the last FLC was only 3 sessions. This table also shows the number of participants, but this is just the number of participants who gave permission to use their assignments for our research study. In addition, we have a little bit of information about the discipline of each faculty member. So over those 26 total participants who we have permission to use their assignments pre and post the FLC, 10 were in arts and humanities, 9 from the social sciences, and 7 from our STEM fields. So once we had the participants with their pre and their post assignment coming into our FLC, and then after the end of their sessions, we set out to measure the success based on what Nicole was speaking about. Was there any change in our 5 core areas? We did this by first anonymizing all of our assignments, and then after a norming session of our coding criteria, each assignment was scored by 2 coders. And this table sort of summarizes what Nicole was speaking about in our Write tool, and it shows the 5 different broad categories, components of our Write tool, but also breaks it out into the different subcategories that we really looked at when we were coding. So in TILT, we looked at purpose, task, and criteria for success. In the rhetorical context, we looked at genre features. We looked to see if there was any context for the students on who they were creating their product for, the audience, and then the purpose of the text for that audience. In information and source use, we ended up with 4 different criteria to look through. And then scaffolding, we looked separately at writing and research scaffolding. And then the evaluation criteria, we looked at, did it parallel the assignment description and assignment purpose? Does it signal to the student the emphasis or weight? And does it give characteristics of high quality work? So when we coded it, so you can go to the next slide, Julia, we scored each of these categories on a score from 0 to 3. 0 meant we didn't see any evidence of that particular subcategory. 1 was emerging, and we talked through in our norming process what each of these meant for each of the categories. 2 is developing, and 3 would be developed, or what we would hope to see in an assignment. So based on this, a perfect score for an assignment would be a 45. Once we scored individually all of the assignments, we did reconcile any score differences between coders that was equal or greater than 2 points. And so looking at some of our results, the overview of the results is that across all participants, we did see a statistically significant increase in our scoring of the assignments coming into our swirl offerings, and then as they exited our swirl offerings. So we have the pre and the post assignment. The averages went from a 14.52, again out of 45, up to a 24.4 out of 45. And in this figure, you can see that there's different colors that represent our different overarching components. And you can visually see here, and I'll show again on the next slide, that the largest changes occurred in our tilt and our evaluation categories. So if we go to the next slide, you can see this, if you would like to see the numbers a little bit deeper. So tilt changed by 3.15, evaluation by 2.52, and then rhetoric, information literacy, and scaffolding were all changed by about 1.5 points. So we're going to dig a little deeper into each of these 5 components. And so I've rearranged this table here from the category, the component that had the greatest change, which was tilt, to the lowest, or scaffolding. You'll see both here the numeric change as well as a percent increase, just to give you a little more context. One thing to keep in mind is that most of the components are out of 9 total points, but information literacy is actually out of 12 points. We had 4 categories in that component, and our scaffolding was only out of 6 total points. So that might skew what you see here a little bit. So looking at our tilt, again, our tilt had 3 different subcategories. We had the purpose, the tasks, and the criteria for success. And you can see here that there were significant increases. These are statistically significant, all of these changes, from our incoming assignments to our outgoing assignments. Overall, there was a 91% increase in our tilt components. The greatest change, which was purpose, which increased by 136%. And you can see here that it really reached up to what we consider a developed criteria. We saw this visually on the assignments themselves, where coming in, it was hard for students to distinguish where the purpose was, but and the assignments going out, there was a very clearly labeled purpose section. One thing to keep in mind when we talk about tilt is, in addition to swirl offerings, there's been other faculty development programs at Santa Clara that discuss tilt. And so our faculty members are not just hearing it from us, they may be hearing it from their colleagues, they may be hearing it from other one-off faculty development offerings as well. Similarly, we saw a significant increase in all the components under evaluation. Overall, there was actually 119% increase in the evaluation criteria. And in particular, we saw an increase in faculty really aligning their evaluation criteria to the purpose. So we saw a shift in rubrics. Well, we saw more rubrics outgoing than we did incoming. In addition, those rubrics were more representative of what the faculty stated the purpose was. So less emphasis on things like grammar and punctuation, and more emphasis on looking for the correct types of sources and writing to the correct type of audience, which is what we were hoping for in our offerings. And again, one thing that we sort of concluded, and we'll reiterate this again later, is that these first 2 categories, tilt and evaluation, were really easy changes for faculty to make in the structure of the assignment itself. It was easy to add a rubric. Maybe they were using a rubric, but just had not communicated that to the students. And in this case, they began to add the rubric either to their, we use Canvas, so to the Canvas course online, or to the actual document handed out to students. So these were visual changes that we could see ourselves as we looked at the assignments, but that meant that the students could also see those changes. I'm going to turn it over now to Julia to talk about our other 3 categories.
Thanks, Laura. So I'm going to talk about our other 3 categories: information literacy, rhetoric, and scaffolding, probably the most familiar terrain for those of us from coming from a WAC perspective. So as Laura mentioned in her overview of our findings, we saw less evidence or less magnitude of change between the incoming to the FLC assignment prompt versions compared to what faculty produced after undergoing the intervention after doing the FLC. So here you can see, for example, we saw increases, as Laura mentioned, throughout all of the areas, but and this was interesting for us to see is that before the FLC, faculty were most likely to include in their assignment prompts guidance about what kinds of sources to use and how to use them. However, those areas increased more modestly compared to the other components of information literacy, only by 22% for source type and 36% for how to use sources. And just to explicate this a little bit, although I think Nicole went over this earlier, source type is just what kinds of sources to use, and this would be something more specific than primary sources or secondary sources, which especially if students are taking courses across multiple disciplines. We're talking about undergraduate students here who are taking both major and gen ed classes. This is a source of considerable confusion, we know from student focus groups. And then secondly, about how to use sources. So do you use quotations? Do you use summary? What kinds of things need to be cited and what kinds of things don't? Those are the things we're talking about source use conventions. On the other hand, faculty were a lot less likely, about half as likely actually, to include guidance to students about how to select sources, what constitutes a high quality source or an appropriate source within this genre. Like you get a list of search results from a database, how do you pick which articles to use, and then about how to cite them. But on the other hand, those areas improved more as a result of the FLC intervention by 76% for source selection and by 63% for citation. What we found particularly interesting, or one thing that was kind of interesting about citations, was that it was surprisingly unusual for faculty to specify even what style of citation to use, like APA or MLA, and almost no one, and this was something that Nicole, as our librarian colleague, brought to our attention, is that almost no one said anything about why to use these citation systems, even to be this is what psychologists use. And very, very rarely do they talk about what the epistemological implications of different types of citation systems are. So it was more of a fiat thing, which is something that, with thinking in the TIL framework about why are we doing this, what's the rationale, was interesting to us. So moving on to rhetoric. So this has to do with disciplinary rhetoric. So again, here overall we saw more modest gains compared to tilt and evaluation, but still gains, especially in areas where there was less to begin with. So similar to information literacy, when it came to using writing assignments as opportunities to teach disciplinary conventions and to introduce students to fields, to the discourse communities of different fields, faculty were a lot more likely in their pre-FLC prompt to detail the expected generic or formal conventions of the assignment students are being asked to create. So for example, the IMRAD article format for STEM fields, or the memo format for business or proposal format, those kinds of things. However, they improved that guidance only modestly, by about 27% on average in their post-FLC efforts. The biggest improvement in the area of rhetoric was for audience. So before the FLC, as an example, 15 of the 26 assignments did not mention audience at all, or they gave only a very non-specific audience that and scored. Therefore, we gave assignment prompts like that as 0. Because these that kind of direction is not very helpful for students to decide which content to choose to write about. What can I expect the audience already knows, and how should I write about it? Diction or register? Who am I talking to? On the other hand, after the FLC, only 8 of the 26 prompts did that same no or minimally useful audience information, resulting in a considerable increase, about 97% in terms of rhetorical guidance from pre to post FLC. Interestingly, and this was something that was very surprising to me, is how could you talk about the purpose of a text without talking about its audience, purpose to whom? But interestingly, we saw that in the initial pre-FLC assignment, actually more faculty talked about, at least in some specificity, about the purpose that the text students were being to create would actually serve, even if they didn't necessarily specify who would be the recipient of that text, who the audience would be. And similarly to audience, we saw a fair amount of improvement in that area, about an 86% improvement compared to pre-FLC. And then lastly, as Laura had mentioned, we looked at scaffolding. We separated this into writing and research. As WAC practitioners, program directors, researchers might be heartened to know that most faculty included evidence of some kind of writing scaffolding, even if it was very minimal or if there was no explanation of why that kind of scaffolding was important in the initial iteration, and again improved it only modestly by about 34% post-FLC. We were especially interested to note that research scaffolding was less common pre-FLC. You can see it's lower on the chart that we present here, but that participants improved their assignments research scaffolding by a greater margin, about 47% following the FLC. Particularly while we were coding, we noticed a considerable decrease in the number of, within regard to research, of 0 scores. There were a fair number of assignments that we gave zeros in our for the pre-FLC, and that there was a noted increase in 3s, that is high scores for scaffolding for writing on the outcomes. So we saw that kind of movement, that we saw a movement to the higher end of the scores for writing scaffolding in the post-FLCs, and a decrease in the number of people who didn't make any reference to scaffolding for research. So I'll say a couple of sort of overview global comments like Laura did, and then pass things over to Nicole to talk about overall conclusions. So as Laura mentioned, compared to the sort of concrete additions that the tilt, purpose, and rubric sections allow you to like visibly insert into the syllabus, information literacy, rhetoric, and scaffolding, which require larger changes to like course design in order to actually like build in scaffolding stages, or to change the type of text that students are being asked to create in order to have a text with a real audience and a recognizable genre. To add more research components, research scaffolding, require like bigger scale changes to the course as a whole, and so maybe account for some of the lowered impact that we see here, especially keeping in mind that we're looking at assignments that revisions that faculty produced at the end of the FLC, not what they might have gone on to do over the summer while they're preparing to teach this class the next time around, kind of thing. And then one other thing that we noticed is that they're kind of like a convergence between the things that were higher scoring initially coming into the FLC and lower scoring coming into the FLC, is there was, as I've noted, generally speaking, less improvement of the scores that were already higher compared to the scores that were lower. And so we wondered if there was maybe sort of like a threshold or a ceiling for the level to which assignment like transparency could reach via these kinds of interventions, or a ceiling to what kind of change we might see simply at the end of the faculty development seminar, as opposed to what we might see if we follow those faculty longitudinally over a longer period of time. Okay, and then with that, I'll pass things back to Nicole to talk about some overall takeaways.
Great, thanks, Julia. So in terms of our conclusions, we have both encouraging signs as well as indications of where more might be done. So in terms of the good news, as we've shared, the faculty assignments showed significant gains in all areas, and they were actually statistically significant in all areas. Also, while we have not measured student learning, these changes should translate to greater learning for all students. And that's an area that we would be interested in looking at further. And then we also thought it was interesting that of all the disciplinary groups, STEM faculty had the most improvement. And finally, while we experimented with a variety of formats, we thought it was really interesting that as few as 3 faculty workshop sessions introduced changes in practice. And in fact, we didn't find significant difference by cohort. And we thought this was really encouraging because while we definitely felt that there were benefits to the longer and more engaged FLC that we conducted, it was also much easier for us to sustain a shorter series of events, which I'm sure would be true on most, if not all, campuses. And also just to share, we do have more detailed data from our analysis, and we'd be happy to share more of that in the Q&A if there's interest. And then in terms of where we need to do more work, the elements of writing research and information literacy saw smaller gains than transparent assignment design, as Julia just discussed. And we found that challenges persist in addressing disciplinary writing and information literacy. This could be because writing, research, and information literacy are more difficult to incorporate comprehensively and may require more substantial revision of assignments. We also speculated that there may be continued gap for faculty in seeing beyond their disciplinary expertise and really relating to or understanding the novice perspective of students. And additionally, several faculty expressed the challenge of appropriately scaffolding writing and research while also covering disciplinary content. So this may make them feel limited in focusing on building up the underlying research and writing skills that could be transferable to other assignments. So those were some of our major takeaways. And before we go into Q&A, just wanted to share a couple of quotes from participants. So this participant shared, last year's FLC has transformed the design of my assignments and rubrics, and in turn has transformed my teaching and grading. The process of designing transparent assignments helped me identify the main skills students needed to succeed on a particular assignment. And now I make it a point to focus my teaching on developing these skills. So in this, we really see how it impacted not just the assignment, but actually the pedagogy of the course and provided greater clarity even for the faculty member. And then just a couple other quick quotes, and I'll just share part of the longer one. So the most important impact from Squirrel discussions was really thinking about my assignments from the student perspective and in a much deeper way than I had before. So that's an example of a faculty member really taking on that perspective and getting a better understanding of the novice experience of the student. And then finally, using the knowledge I gained from Swirl has helped me get a much better match between what I envisioned for an assignment and what my students actually submit. So yeah, clearly more clarity for the student, and then ultimately a better outcome, which is, you know, what we all want. So, all right. And now I'll hand it over to Julia, who's going to lead us in our Q&A.
Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking with us for talking about our FLC and the results of our work on assessing it. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. If you want to type them into the chat, I can use that to kind of call on you, or if you want to use hand raising or just turn off your mic and share your question to do a little bit of discussion, either about what we presented here, if it coordinates, how it might coordinate with stuff that you've done or seen or participated in on your campus, or thinking about similar efforts that you've led and engaged, things like that. Okay, Kelly, come on over.
Hello. Let's see if I can start my video here.
Yes.
Hi, apologies for my casual bedroom backdrop, but I just wanted to talk about something that just was top of mind for me listening to your presentation. I teach a graduate course, and as part of the course, we do a deep dive on assignment design. And I frame it using WAC scholarship, using engaging ideas, using the Meaningful Writing Project and some of assignments across the curriculum. What surprises me is how often my students do not connect the assessment criteria to the purpose, which is exactly what you guys were describing. And whenever I have kind of critiqued that in the feedback, and I've used a rubric that has that as a component, so they should be able to see it in advance or whatever, it seems like I get a lot of surprise back where people are just like not anticipating that comment. And so I guess my question to you is sort of twofold. Why do you think that's something that people struggle with, even after they receive some intervention or some look at TILT, which I feel like TILT is right on board with all that? And second, do you think that your rubric could be sort of adapted to leverage or draw greater attention to that particular feature in like a graduate school context, like the one that I'm discussing.
Folks, questions, responses? Go ahead.
I could comment on I'm a librarian, so I'm more thinking of the information literacy component. In terms of the alignment with purpose, when I think about the disconnects that happen between assessment and purpose in terms of information literacy, I think sometimes faculty don't really, they think of the research that they did or do and not what's appropriate to the assignment. So sometimes they will assess based on how they would do research rather than what would actually be the appropriate research for that assignment. So that's one thing that I would say about a disconnect between the assessment and purpose in terms of the infolit piece, if that makes sense.
I think in terms of the writing, again, this is not something we've like parsed really closely with our data, so this is very speculative. So one of the things in the FLC that faculty look at is the Engaging Ideas book that talks about different types of rubrics, and people typically are much more attracted to the matrix style rubric which I think he calls the analytical rubric than the holistic rubric. And I think with regard to writing, part of what oftentimes happens, even to some extent with the revised rubrics that faculty use, and certainly with the pre-FLC rubrics, if they have one, is that they don't have a very sophisticated way of thinking about what they want from the writing. And so like especially in the pre-FLC version, if they say anything about writing, it's like concision, correctness, which of course from a writing studies perspective, like one is very simplistic and two is highly tied to like racism, gatekeeping, classism, et cetera. And like, like white supremacist, linguistic hegemony, that kind of thing. So, and so they're like, well, if not that, then what do we do? Like, how do we spell out what we want? And like, it's kind of like, it has to do with this recursive nature of assignment and course development that Chris mentioned in our terms of the swirl's kind of overall mission, which is that if you are gonna get into a greater level of specificity, and I would guess this is true for info literacy too, about what you want to see from students writing and from students' use of sources, if you're going to spell that out in greater detail, you realize that you then have to teach it. And if you have to teach it, that means making space for it in the course, which is where you get into this kind of infinite loop. And we all know this, that from curriculum development, that's how it is. It's an infinite process. It's like you change one thing, then you change something else, and you have to change something else, and you have to change something else. And that I think that has to and so people tend to default to like much more simplistic understandings of information literacy, of writing, that are not in line with the increasing sophistication of the assignment itself that they're developing. Like what we really saw that in terms of was that there was a mismatch between what they described wanting in the assignment design or in the assignment prompt compared to what they then assessed. And it's like students smartly oftentimes will take their guideline from the rubric because that's what's going to produce their grade. And use a student who's kind of like good at being a student will oftentimes use the rubric as a lens through which to read the assignment. And so what we started to wonder is by not giving the rubric more weight, where we may be undermining some of the impact that assignment revision might have if we didn't kind of close the loop by making sure that the assessment mechanism rubric was more in line with the assignment, the changes that have been made to the assignment.
Yeah, I think I think what my colleagues have said is exactly spot on. We were so surprised sometimes to see the weights well, first of all, there were often no weights initially, but then when there were weights, it's like, how can this possibly be worth 50 points out of 200 when it's not even addressed in the assignment at all? And conversely, there might be, it could flip the other way too. And so it was, I think that the weighting was really one of the most interesting things that we noted as we were scoring. And one of the revelatory things that when we brought it back to the faculty, it was pretty much kind of on par, I think, with first being exposed to tilt if they hadn't been. It's like, well, of course I know why I'm giving this assignment, you know, and of course I know that I'm asking the students to do certain tasks, but then when they really started to unpack, you know, what does it mean to position that assignment in the frame of your course, in the framework of your discipline, or in real life, it really hit a lot of the faculty that they were making a lot of assumptions about, and that to make it more transparent for them was also a benefit in getting clarity, and so it benefited faculty and it benefited the students as well.
And say anything to say about like does this align with what you've seen, Kelly, in your graduate teaching, or what do you think?
You know, it really does. It really does. And a lot of what you were saying, Julia, where these conceptions of writing suddenly pop up, and it's like, you know, this is worth a big amount, but that term is never defined and it's not included in any kind of rationale for giving the assignment. And then I found that it's just a very sensitive topic when you're talking to people about their teaching materials and trying to sort of open that door. So you know, when I most recently taught the class, I actually backed up from talking about the assessment criteria as a primary thing for alignment. Even though I do think it's really important, because it just, I don't know, it didn't feel like a conversation that went places, even though I felt like, because I don't think they have the chance to really revise or buy in. And I'm thinking that maybe my own rubric for looking at their assignment prompt, like I'm wondering, what can I do? What can I pull from your presentation to help think about alignment in a more productive way? So I feel like this has been really, really helpful for me.
And I think just like one thing on that is, I think in our own FLC, and this may be something to alter in future iterations of it, is it's like, first we do all this work on the assignment prompt and we go deep into all these different areas, transparency, rhetoric, info-lit, scaffolding, and then we're like, one day on rubrics. And when actually the rubric, as we're talking about, the rubric needs to, like, the rubric needs to be retooled for every part of that change that's gone on in the major assignment. And so and so this is making me wonder in future, because part of the reason for us doing this assessment is like, what changes might we think about making in future iterations of this FLC? And even though we saw a lot of changes in the rubrics, like we're identifying a lot of room for growth, especially because of the strong influence that rubrics exert over students. Again, like I mentioned, like a student who like knows how to play the game will really pay attention to the rubric, because that tells you what you really need to know or what you really need to do. And so if we may have that parity between the sophisticated purpose of the assignment that's built into the prompt and the rubric, then it feels like a lot of that work is lost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would add on the buy-in tip, and you may already do this, but I think in our workshops, it was really helpful to go back to, we do this because it's more equitable for more students. And I think that was really helpful in terms of getting past some, you know, feelings people might have around getting feedback on their assignments or making changes.
So this is a question that, or it's a sort of the connection that Kimberly brought up a bit ago. And so if you want to, I'm going to ask you to expand on this if you'd be willing to do so. It says, I'm struck by the similarities of tilt and write in the QM standards for higher education, and then links to the document. I am not at all familiar with the QM standards for higher education. So if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit, Kimberly, on what those are maybe, and what kind, and the similarities.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Quality Matters is a company who helps people develop online courses that meet what they consider the minimum standards for a well-done course. And so there's all different standards. Some are for, like grade school. This one that I put up there is for higher education. But again, it basically has people not looking at how people grade, but looking at their course shells and then looking to see if they can find these things and are they very well and very explicit. Because we find that a lot of times we have objectives and we have people write assignments, but maybe we don't really point out to them clearly where to find those resources. The resources might be in our course, but somehow they can't link it to the assignment. So you might say in the assignment, be sure to go to, let's say, module 2 under this heading to look and relook at these assignments or relook at these resources we had you look at previously. And this is how you're going to use that resource to meet these expectations. And what some schools do is they try to get all their courses Quality Matters certified. I worked for years in an online RN to BSN nursing course and taught literacy in the discipline. And this is one of the things we use to get the course certified nationally as being a Quality Matters course. And it's very useful because they actually have courses where you can take a course of looking at your course and how well does it meet these standards? How might you change it to make those standards? And then you get the entire group of writers or course developers or lead teachers that will also give you suggestions on your course of what you can do differently. And so it's a really useful experience. But when I was looking at your tilt and I was looking at the right, I thought, well, that tells me a little bit more how to do it for writing. But I was just struck of how similar different disciplines go after the same thing. And we're all looking to find pretty much the same kind of transparent assignment where we put things in scaffolding. And I know in the nursing courses, what we do is we have them take technical writing first. And I work hand in hand with the technical writing people because we decide what is going to be in their course. And then I have the very first discipline writing course of how I'm going to build on them. And then the next course is evidence-based practice that builds even more on search strategies and how to write in a more disciplined way. And so it's something that I find useful. It does cost a lot of money. It was over $1,000 a course to be certified. And so we're moving away from getting the official certification, but we have found it extremely useful to take those courses and to use these rubrics when we look at our courses to see what we might have missed that we could do better.
I think, Kimberly, that's really, really pertinent to what we did. And you know, when one is looking at doing this kind of work without, you know, signing up with a company, you know, what we really found in our FLCs worked well was that combination of the faculty evaluating their own work, making notes. Sometimes we would bring highlighters to the FLC meetings and say, okay, looking at this rubric, looking at tilt or looking at write, identify, you know, what you think, where you think you're nailing it and where you think there's room for improvement. And then we did a lot of that kind of assignment design teamwork, you know, charrettes, where then the faculty themselves, other faculty who often weren't from that discipline, which was very helpful, would then read their assignments and give additional feedback, really trying to stick with the criteria. And then at the end, the swirl team would also provide kind of their feedback. And so I think that layering, you know, that kind of iterative process of self-reflection, hearing from peers, and then and non-disciplinary peers, and then also hearing from those of us who had been through some of this assignment redesign work a lot was really helpful in helping the faculty get better towards that standard of quality that you know we can define.
I have to agree with you in that I really found that although I caught a lot of things myself, my peers that were from a different discipline were less versed in the discipline, and therefore they were more like beginning students who did not know the basics that we took for granted. And so I would agree with you that reiterative process is so important.
Just to dovetail back to something, Kimberly, that you mentioned a bit at the beginning of your comments, the fact that write and tilt are so close to each other is by design, because the first FLC that we did, we used the tilt framework, but we didn't yet have our own write tool. And what we found was that faculty had a lot easier time applying it felt like faculty had an easier time applying the tilt things, for which we had all these checklists and documentation that kind of allowed for more of a self-scoring kind of thing. It seemed that they had an easier time noticing some of those issues, and which is part of the reason why we developed the write tool. Because again, if you are familiar with the tilt framework, they don't say much specifically about writing and information literacy, which one was our specific focus, and two is its own whole, as we know, its own whole field of scholarly, pedagogically related stuff. And so it felt like there was a lot to be added to tilt framework for writing and research intensive projects. I'd also echo what you said and what Chris had said, that that was part of why we have stuck with the model of cross-disciplinary cohorts of faculty, because the people from other disciplines are really helpful in helping faculty see what is implicit and what's not common knowledge in their own assignments from faculty in different disciplines. And like when we pair up people to charrette each other's assignment to give feedback on each other's assignment prompts, we work hard to pair people from different disciplines so that we can get as much of that outsider feedback as possible within what's possible with our cohorts. Jennifer had a question about faculty volunteering for FLCs. This is not something we talked about. The first year when faculty were volunteering for a year-long faculty learning community, they received, I think, a $500 stipend. Chris, you can correct me on this. And then since then, when faculty were participating in shorter running workshops, they have been unpaid, I believe. Is that right, Chris?
We often provide books. So, for example, we provided the craftive research, right? The bean, engaging ideas, and then we also really emphasize that this is valuable professional development, in that it's worthy of noting, as we present our portfolios and our work for our annual evaluations. We wanted to elevate that work and make sure also that, since this project was sponsored by our provost office, that there was a recognition that this was a meaningful professional development experience.
I would also say that I know that this is an issue, especially for faculty for campuses that have union contracts, that professional development work must be paid, or required professional development has to be compensated, that kind of thing. So this is at our campus, there's a pretty strong tradition of willing engagement, self-selected engagement in this kind of faculty development programming. So that is a big institutional difference, I would say, between folks. And I feel like we have a larger proportion of full-time employed faculty, especially in the College of Arts and Sciences, which is where we had our largest base of participants in arts and humanities, compared to faculty or universities who rely a lot on part-time adjunct faculty. So there's a greater sort of people are more available typically for things like this, and that it is there's a lot of faculty, even who are on non-tenure track contracts, have a greater sense of integration into the university community compared to other institutional dynamics, which is another sort of contextual consideration here. I don't know if that was what you were getting at, Jennifer, when you asked this question. Thanks. Anything else? Either questions about, all right, Malka?
Hi, thank you. I think I've finally formulated my question. I teach in STEM subjects, so I'm interested in a little bit of pursuing the STEM side. I'm not so surprised that you saw the most progress in STEM, because I'm guessing they probably started generally lowest. because of lack of sort of awareness in those fields about these kinds of moves. But my question is about this sort of articulation of purpose relative toward writing. One of the things I'm thinking about right now as I teach in a lot of situations where the papers that STEM students are being asked to write are based on canned labs or sort of picking up background knowledge, right? Like there's this idea that they're not at the cutting edge of research, so we're not able to ask them to do those types of research assignments. So basically, they're sort of just filling in the gaps in their knowledge. And what I've been thinking about is when the purpose that the instructor has for the piece of writing is learn this background material and demonstrate that you know this background material, but the purpose of the genre of writing is not in line with that. You know, how to sort of bridge these gaps. And you talked about that a little bit in terms of thinking about artificial genre. I forget the language you use to sort of describe the mismatch, but I'm wondering, what did you offer? Did you encounter these kinds of situations? What kind of guidance did you offer in them? The genre problem. Thank you. Yeah. So, you know, what kinds of things did you talk about with your STEM folk if these kinds of issues came up?
I'm trying to think, and maybe like other folks can weigh in on this. If we talked very much about if we talk with people directly about like, you should switch your assignment to be this kind of assignment, a lot like, so in some, and it was different too for people who were teaching intro level STEM courses versus more advanced STEM courses. So in the more advanced, like elective classes, they were like, write an article like the articles that we read in this class. And that's a lot easier because it's, although their research is likely going to be much simpler, it's the format and the purpose and the audience and the genre are all very similar. So you can just be like, use this as a model. And there's also the question too, it's like, is that really useful? Like of students majoring in biology, how many of them are going to become research biologists who publish in the Annals of the American Biological Society? Question. And so thinking maybe of what we saw some people who were teaching more intro level courses had students write like a proposal to like a company, and which is maybe the more typical career path of somebody who's majoring in the sciences, right? Is to become like a bench chemist at this pharmaceutical research firm or something like that, to use this method. Like it was, and so it was kind of like, it was a canned lab because the method was like photospectroscopy or something like that. But it was like, write a proposal that provides a rationale for using this particular procedure for this application. And I think maybe other people on the team can weigh in on this, but I can't remember if the task was specified or if the task was open where they had to identify a task and then identify an appropriate method, but where there was like, that was one of the ways that people balanced the need to have a legitimate or realistic audience and genre and purpose while also teaching students for whom this is their first chemistry class.
Yeah, one of the things we also did in one of the first few sessions with our faculty is had them brainstorm a list of the type of writing people in that career do. The type of writing they do as a faculty member, but also for example, I'm in civil engineering, what do civil engineers write? And I think that helped them to sort of put the assignments in better context. So yes, I'm not going to ask my students to write a research paper, but I can have them find and then model after consulting papers that consulting firms write. And the background part, I can have them just do the background section of that type of document. And that also helps faculty members and students to find the audience, right? Because if it's for a consulting firm, then you're writing to the agency who is funding you, for example. But what we've also seen a lot of faculty doing is some of the products aren't necessarily papers or writing, but they have like an additional piece, like an infographic or a poster. And that type of product, we still consider research and writing because it still requires that same sort of background.
I would say also that one thing that we also noticed when we were coding the assignments is that nobody scored high in every category. Is that, and this is, and if you think about your own teaching experience, this makes sense. It's like this assignment, we're really focusing on the research components, and the writing components not so much. Or in this case, I really want to establish students' background knowledge in this field, and so they're basically writing like an all about report, which doesn't really exist in the real world, but they need to know this knowledge. And so in a different assignment in the class, they write something that's heavily audience driven, like heavily informed by generic norms in terms of like organization and register and things like that. But in this case, like what I really want them, and this is, I think, especially important to think about in disciplinary courses as opposed to like first year writing or like courses where writing is like the raison d'etre, is that not every assignment maybe is going to be really driven by a strong sense of audience, because the purpose of this assignment may be for the student to learn some content, but then the grading needs to reflect that. And that's where some of these questions come up, because one thing that we talked about, or we learned about when we did the focus groups with faculty before we started to design these FLCs, was like faculty were like, I'm just so mad about X. Like, who would ever write something like this? It's like, well, somebody who's only ever written a paper in an English class. And it's not so surprising, perhaps, that they wrote their lab report like an essay, because that's the only kind of long form writing they've ever done in school. So to get teachers to think, and this is kind of what Laura was talking about, like, what is it that you want students to get out of this assignment? And that's where the weight of your description in the prompt should be. That's where the weight of the point distribution in your rubric should fall, and that not every assignment has to do every single thing.
Thank you so much.
So we are just about at time, but if anyone has a last question they want to slip in before we wrap up, now's the time. All right, well, thank you all so much for attending this really wonderful session. It was such a joy. And I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your conference.